Before gold had value or empires had names, a simple white crystal held the power of life and death. It was the first currency, the reason for wars, and the silent force that carved the paths of civilization. This is the story of salt, the mineral that shaped our world in ways we have long since forgotten. Our story begins not with a man, a king, or an army, but with the earth itself, in the vast, silent, and immeasurable expanse of deep time. It begins with the slow, patient work of water and sun. Long before the first stirrings of life on land, the world was an aqueous planet, its surface covered by a shallow primordial ocean. This was not the sea we know today, with its familiar continents and currents, but a global body of water holding within it the dissolved mineral essence of the young planet. Rocks, subject to the endless friction of wind and rain, slowly surrendered their chemical secrets into the water, and among these was sodium chloride, the simple, elegant molecule that would one day be known as salt. This ancient ocean was a dilute planetary soup, and for millions upon millions of years, the concentration of salt within it grew, a slow, imperceptible infusion that would set the stage for all life to come. The Earth's crust was not static. It moved with a geological slowness that makes the turning of centuries seem like a frantic rush. Great land masses drifted, collided, and buckled. And in this planetary dance, vast sections of the ocean were sometimes trapped, cut off from the main body of water, to form immense inland seas. Here, under the relentless, unwavering gaze of the sun, the second act of our story began, the Great Evaporation. For millennia, the sun would beat down on these trapped seas. With no new water flowing in to replenish them, they began to shrink. The process was unthinkably slow, a patient exhalation of water vapor into the atmosphere, molecule by molecule. As the water level dropped over thousands of years, the concentration of the dissolved minerals within it became ever higher. The water became a thick, heavy brine, saturated with the planet's elemental legacy. Eventually, a tipping point was reached. The water could hold no more salt in its embrace, and so the salt began to return to a solid state, precipitating out of the brine in a silent, crystalline rain. It settled on the floor of the dying sea, layer upon layer, year after year, century after century. The first layers were thin, delicate sheets of pure white crystal. As the process continued, other minerals, dust from the air, silt from ancient rivers, would mix in, creating bands of gray, pink, and brown within the growing deposit. Over eons, these layers of precipitated salt, known as evaporates, grew to be hundreds, and in some cases thousands, of feet thick. The sea was gone, but its salty soul remained, buried under the weight of time. This was not the end of the salt's journey, but merely a transformation. As geological ages passed, these massive salt beds were buried by layers of sediment. The immense pressure from the rock above and the heat from the Earth's core worked a strange magic on the salt. Salt, unlike rock, behaves like a very slow-moving fluid under pressure. It is less dense than the surrounding rock, and so with the patience of a geological age, it began to push its way upward. It flowed like the thickest honey, seeking out fissures and weaknesses in the overlying rock, pushing and shouldering its way toward the surface. This upward movement formed vast underground columns of salt known as salt domes, or diapirs. Some of these domes would rise for millions of years, creating massive subterranean mountains of nearly pure salt, their peaks sometimes lying just below the surface of the Earth, a hidden treasure waiting to be discovered. In other parts of the world, the salt remained in vast flat beds far below the ground, great subterranean plains of white crystal, and in still other places tectonic forces would lift these ancient seabeds, thrusting them upward to form mountain ranges. In these mountains, the veins of rock salt were exposed to the sky once more, where the patient work of rain and erosion would begin to dissolve them, carrying the salt back into the rivers and, eventually, back to the sea, continuing the planet's endless salt cycle. It was into this world of hidden salt that life finally emerged. The first single-celled organisms evolved in the salty broth of the ocean, their internal chemistry forever tied to the mineral balance of the water around them. Every living cell, from the simplest bacterium to the most complex neuron in a human brain, requires a delicate balance of salt and water to function. Salt is not a luxury for life. It is a necessity, a fundamental component of the electrical and chemical systems that create movement, thought, and consciousness. For the creatures of the sea, salt was abundant and unremarkable. But for the creatures that first crawled onto the land, salt became a challenge. They carried the memory of the ocean within their own bodies, in their blood and in their cells. But their new environment was one of scarcity. They had to seek salt out to find it and consume it in order to survive. And so the first great salt hunt began. Animals, driven by a deep biological craving, developed an uncanny ability to find it. They would travel for miles following ancient instinctual paths to places where salt was exposed to the world. They gathered at natural salt springs where underground water flowed up through salt deposits and emerged as a salty brine. They congregated at salt flats, the dry beds of ephemeral lakes in arid regions where a thin white crust of salt would form after a rain, and they would find and lick the exposed seams of rock salt in mountains and riverbeds. These places, known as salt licks, became sacred ground in the animal kingdom, neutral territories where predator and prey would often stand side by side, united by a shared, desperate need for the taste of the primordial sea. Early humans, as they spread out from the savannas of Africa, were no different. They too were driven by this deep physiological need. In their early days as hunter-gatherers, they likely satisfied their need for salt from the blood and meat of the animals they hunted. But as their diet began to include more plants, and as they moved into regions farther from the ocean, they too would have joined the great animal pilgrimage to the salt licks. They would have watched the animals, learned from them, and discovered the life-giving power of this strange, white rock. They would have scraped the salt crust from the dry lake beds, packing it in leaves or animal hides to carry back to their camps. They would have soaked their food in the water of the salt springs, discovering not only that it improved the taste, but that it also seemed to make the food last longer. This was a revolutionary discovery, though its full implications would not be understood for millennia. In these first tentative interactions, humanity was only just beginning to grasp the power it held. This simple mineral born of a long-dead sea and buried for an eternity was not just a rock. It was a key to flavor, a key to preservation, and a key to life itself. The first chapter of humanity's long and complex relationship with salt had been written not in ink, but in the slow, patient language of geology and the deep, abiding craving of biology. As humanity transitioned from the wandering life of the hunter-gatherer to the settled existence of the farmer, the problem of salt became more acute. A diet rich in grains and vegetables contained far less natural salt than one based on meat and blood. The small scattered communities of the Neolithic era needed a reliable, consistent supply of this essential mineral. And this need became one of the first great drivers of technology and trade. The casual gathering of salt from natural licks was no longer sufficient. Humanity had to learn how to produce it, to harvest it from the earth and the sea in a systematic way. This transformation from gathering to production marks the moment when salt ceased to be merely a nutrient and began its long journey to becoming a commodity, a source of wealth and a cornerstone of power. The earliest methods of salt production were elegant in their simplicity, born of careful observation of the natural world. Along the coastlines of the warm, sun-drenched parts of the world, from the Mediterranean to the shores of China, people developed the technique of solar evaporation. They would find low-lying coastal marshes or tidal flats and construct a series of shallow, interconnected ponds or pans, separated by low walls of earth or clay. At high tide or through man-made channels, they would allow seawater to flood the first of these pans. Then they would close it off and let the sun and the wind begin their patient work. As the water evaporated, the brine would become more concentrated. This heavier, saltier water would then be channeled into a second pond, and then a third, and so on, becoming progressively more saturated with each move. This was a slow, deliberate process, a kind of controlled desert making that required weeks or even months of careful management. The salt makers had to be keen observers of the weather, understanding the subtle interplay of sun, wind, and humidity. They had to know precisely when to move the brine from one pan to the next to achieve the purest result. Finally, in the last and shallowest of the pans, the fully saturated brine would evaporate completely, leaving behind a thick, white crust of pure sea salt. The workers would then wade into the pans with wooden rakes and shovels, scraping up the harvest of crystals, which would be piled into glittering white mounds to dry fully in the sun. These salt fields, with their geometric patterns of shallow ponds shimmering under the bright sun, were among the world's first factories, places where human ingenuity harnessed the power of nature to create a vital product. Inlands, away from the sea, other methods were developed. In many parts of the world, from ancient Europe to the forests of North America, people discovered salty springs. Here, underground water that had flowed through buried salt deposits came to the surface naturally. This water, or brine, was a gift, but the salt was trapped within it. To release it, a different kind of technology was required: fire. The people of the Hallstatt culture, in the heart of what is now Austria, became early masters of this technique over 2,500 years ago. They would collect the brine in large, wide-mouthed clay pots. Then they would build great fires and place these pots over the flames, beginning a long, slow process of boiling for hours. The brine would simmer and steam, the water slowly being driven off into the air. It was a fuel-intensive process, requiring vast amounts of wood to keep the fires going. As the water boiled away, the salt would recrystallize, forming a thick slurry at the bottom of the pot. The pot would then be allowed to cool, or sometimes it would be deliberately broken, revealing a solid, cone-shaped loaf of salt, a standardized unit that was easy to store and trade. This method, known as open-pan salt making, would remain one of the most important forms of salt production in forested regions for thousands of years. The third and most arduous method of salt production was mining. In places where ancient salt domes had pushed their way close to the surface, or where tectonic uplift had exposed veins of rock salt, humanity learned to quarry this white gold directly from the earth. The salt mines at Hallstatt, which give the Iron Age culture its name, are among the oldest known in the world. Here, beginning as early as 1500 BCE, miners descended into the darkness of the mountain. Their tools were simple and primitive: picks made of bronze and antlers, wooden shovels, and leather bags for carrying the salt. They worked by the dim, flickering light of torches in a labyrinth of narrow tunnels and deep shafts. The work was incredibly dangerous. The tunnels were prone to collapse, and the air could be stale and difficult to breathe. But the reward was immense. The rock salt, or halite, that they chipped away from the tunnel walls was a valuable and concentrated commodity. They would break it into manageable blocks and haul it to the surface, where it would begin its journey to distant markets. The Wieliczka salt mine in Poland, which began operations in the 13th century and continued for over 700 years, is a breathtaking testament to the scale of these operations. Its miners carved not just tunnels, but vast, cathedral-like underground chambers, chapels with altars and statues sculpted entirely from the grayish rock salt, and even an underground lake, a subterranean world built on the pursuit of a single mineral. With the advent of reliable production methods, salt was transformed. It was no longer just a substance for personal consumption. It was a product that could be created in surplus, stored, and transported. It was durable, universally needed, and easily divisible, making it the perfect candidate for an early form of currency. Long before the first coins were minted, a block of salt was a recognized unit of value. Roman soldiers who were tasked with guarding the vital salt roads were famously paid, at least in part, with an allowance of salt known as a salarium. It is from this Latin root that we derive our modern word salary, a linguistic ghost that reminds us of a time when a man's wages were paid in the same substance he used to season his food. As its value became clear, those in power were quick to recognize the strategic importance of controlling its production and distribution. The first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, established a state monopoly on salt in the 3rd century BCE, one of the first of its kind in the world. By controlling the salt, he controlled a vast and reliable source of tax revenue that helped to fund his massive armies and ambitious construction projects, including the Great Wall. The salt tax became a recurring feature of Chinese imperial policy for the next 2 millennia. Similarly, the Roman Republic and later the Empire took control of the great salt pans at Ostia, near the mouth of the Tiber River, ensuring that the city of Rome had a cheap and steady supply, a policy that helped to keep the populace content. By controlling the salt, rulers controlled a fundamental necessity of life. They could reward their friends, punish their enemies, and fund their ambitions, all through the administration of a simple white crystal. From a humble nutrient, salt had become one of the first great pillars of the state, a source of wealth and an instrument of power. With the rise of cities and the establishment of centralized states, the demand for salt grew far beyond what local sources could supply. A great logistical challenge emerged: how to move this heavy, bulky commodity from the places of its production, the coastal salt pans and the inland mines, to the burgeoning population centers where it was desperately needed. The solution to this problem was the creation of vast, sprawling trade networks, some of the earliest and most enduring in human history. These were the salt roads, arteries of commerce that snaked across continents, linking disparate cultures and economies in a shared pursuit of white gold. These routes were not just pathways for a single commodity. They were conduits for the flow of goods, ideas, and people, and they helped to shape the economic and political geography of the ancient world. In Italy, one of the earliest and most famous of these routes was the Via Salaria, the Salt Road. This ancient trackway ran from the salt pans at the mouth of the Tiber River, near Rome, inland into the mountainous country of the Sabine people. For centuries, long before Rome was a republic, let alone an empire, this path was trodden by men and mules, their packs laden with blocks of precious sea salt. They trudged up the winding valleys of the Apennine Mountains, bringing the taste of the sea to the isolated pastoral communities of the interior. The control of this road was a strategic priority for the early Romans, a key to their economic dominance over their neighbors. As Rome grew, the path was eventually paved and engineered into one of the great Roman roads, a testament in stone to the foundational importance of a simple mineral. A far more dramatic and arduous salt road existed in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Sahara Desert. For over 1,000 years, from the Middle Ages until the modern era, great caravans of camels would undertake a perilous journey across the world's largest desert, linking the salt mines of the north with the gold-rich empires of West Africa. In places like Tagaza, in the heart of the Sahara, miners would quarry huge slabs of pure rock salt from the bed of a long-dead desert lake. The conditions were brutal. The settlement was so remote and barren that even the houses were built from blocks of salt. From here, the great camel caravan, sometimes numbering in the thousands, would set out. The journey was a slow, monotonous, and dangerous affair, a plodding trek that could take months to complete. The camels, guided by Tuareg nomads who knew the desert's secrets, would navigate by the stars and the subtle shifts in the landscape, moving from one scarce oasis to the next. The sun was merciless, and the threat of sandstorms and bandits was ever present. The cargo they carried was so valuable that in the markets of Timbuktu and other West African cities, salt was often traded for an equal weight of gold. The salt was desperately needed in the hot, humid climate of the south, both to replenish the body's losses through sweat and to preserve food. The gold, meanwhile, was desired by the merchants of the north. This trans-Saharan trade in salt and gold was the economic bedrock of a series of powerful West African empires, including the Ghana, Mali, and Songhai empires. The wealth it generated funded great centers of learning and culture, all built on the exchange of a glittering yellow metal for a simple white crystal. The movement of salt was not limited to land. In Europe, great river systems like the Rhine and the Danube became liquid salt roads. Heavy, flat-bottomed barges laden with salt from the great mines of Austria and Germany would be poled and towed along these waterways. The journey was slow, governed by the pace of the river's current. The bargemen would spend weeks on the water, living a semi-nomadic life as they guided their precious cargo to the towns and cities that dotted the riverbanks. In Asia, the Grand Canal of China, a man-made waterway stretching for over 1,000 miles, was another vital artery for the salt trade, allowing the emperors to move salt from the productive coastal regions to the vast interior of their empire. The immense effort expended to move salt across these vast distances was driven by more than just its necessity as a nutrient and a seasoning. Salt had another almost magical property that made it one of the most valuable substances in the pre-modern world. It was a powerful preservative. In an age before refrigeration, the putrefaction of food was a constant and pressing problem. The bounty of a good harvest or a successful hunt could quickly be lost to decay. Salt offered a solution. By drawing the water out of the cells of meat, fish, and vegetables through the process of osmosis, salt created an environment where the bacteria and molds that cause decay could not survive. This discovery was revolutionary. It allowed for the long-term storage of food, freeing humanity from the tyranny of the seasons. The fisherman who brought in a massive catch of cod or herring no longer had to see his wealth rot on the docks. He could salt it, either by packing it in dry salt or by soaking it in a heavy brine. The salted fish would last for months or even years, becoming a durable, transportable source of protein. Great fishing industries, like the cod fisheries of the North Atlantic and the herring fisheries of the Baltic, were built entirely on the back of salt. Fleets of ships would sail to distant fishing grounds, their holds filled with salt. They would catch and gut the fish at sea, salting them down in barrels immediately. The preserved fish could then be transported all over the world, providing a cheap and reliable source of food for everyone from sailors on long voyages to the inland populations of Europe. Likewise, farmers could preserve their meat. After slaughtering a pig or a cow, the meat could be cured with salt, becoming ham, bacon, or salted beef. This process allowed families to have a supply of meat that would last them through the long, lean months of winter. Armies on the march and navies at sea depended on salted meat and fish to survive. A military campaign was as dependent on its supply of salted provisions as it was on its supply of weapons. The great voyages of discovery in the age of exploration, which saw European ships circle the globe, would have been impossible without barrels of salted cod and beef stacked in their holds. Salt allowed humanity to conquer not just distance but also time, by preserving the fleeting abundance of one season to be consumed in the scarcity of the next. It was the silent, humble, and essential ingredient that underpinned the expansion of empires, the exploration of the globe, and the very survival of communities. As societies became more complex and states grew more organized, the administrative view of salt shifted once again. It was no longer seen merely as a vital commodity to be traded, but as a perfect object of taxation. Because every household, rich or poor, needed salt, a tax on it was a tax on everyone. It was easy to administer, impossible to evade, and capable of generating a steady, predictable stream of revenue for the state. From the medieval period through the 18th century, governments across the world, particularly in Europe, turned to salt monopolies and salt taxes as a primary means of funding their increasingly expensive ambitions. This transformation of salt into a tool of state finance would have profound consequences, making it a source of deep resentment and, in some cases, a catalyst for popular revolt. Nowhere was the salt tax more infamous or more oppressive than in pre-revolutionary France. Known as the gabelle, this tax was not a simple uniform levy. It was a complex and deeply unjust system that varied wildly from region to region. The kingdom was divided into several districts, each with a different level of taxation. In the areas of the Grande Gabelle, which included Paris and the heart of the kingdom, the tax was crushingly high. In these regions, the sale of salt was a strict state monopoly. Private production or sale was forbidden. Citizens were not only forced to buy their salt from official, state-sanctioned warehouses, but they were also legally required to purchase a certain minimum amount of salt per year, per person, at the fixed exorbitant price. This was known as the sel du devoir, or salt of duty. The administration of the gabelle required a vast and intrusive bureaucracy. An army of tax collectors known as fermiers généraux, or tax farmers, were granted the right to collect the tax in exchange for a lump sum payment to the crown. These tax farmers were notorious for their ruthlessness, as their own profit depended on how much they could extract from the populace. They employed guards or garkas to police the salt trade, who would patrol the roads, search travelers, and raid homes in search of contraband salt. The penalties for smuggling or for failing to pay the gabelle were severe, ranging from heavy fines to imprisonment, condemnation to the galleys, and even death. The injustice of the system was a constant source of anger and misery for the common people of France. Salt smuggling became a widespread act of popular resistance. Entire communities would engage in the illicit trade, moving salt at night along hidden paths from the low-tax regions on the coast, like Brittany, to the high-tax regions of the interior. It was a dangerous game of cat and mouse, and thousands were arrested and punished for it every year. The gabelle came to symbolize everything that was wrong with the Ancien Regime: its arbitrary power, its deep inequality, and its callous disregard for the suffering of the poor. It was a tax not on luxury, but on a necessity of life, a tax on the tears in a peasant's stew. When the French Revolution finally erupted in 1789, the abolition of the hated gabelle was one of the first and most popular demands of the revolutionary assemblies. The storming of the Bastille was a symbolic act, but the dismantling of the salt tax was a tangible victory that affected the daily life of every person in France. The political importance of salt was not confined to France. It played a surprisingly crucial, though often overlooked, role in the American Revolution as well. The American colonies had a thriving fishing industry and a large agricultural sector, both of which were heavily dependent on a steady supply of salt for preserving food. While some salt was produced locally in coastal salt pans, the colonies were heavily reliant on imports, particularly cheap, high-quality salt from the British West Indies and southern Europe. When the War for Independence began, the British Royal Navy established a powerful blockade of American ports. One of their strategic goals was to cut off the supply of essential goods to the colonies, and salt was at the top of the list. The British understood that by creating a salt famine, they could cripple the Continental Army's ability to feed itself. Without salt, the meat provisions for the soldiers would quickly spoil. An army without a reliable food supply cannot fight. The salt shortage became a critical logistical crisis for George Washington and the revolutionary leadership. The Continental Congress desperately tried to encourage domestic salt production. They offered bounties and subsidies for anyone who could establish new salt works. A number of small-scale operations were set up along the coast, from Cape Cod to the Carolinas, using the slow process of solar evaporation or the fuel-intensive method of boiling seawater in large iron pans. These efforts, however, could not come close to meeting the immense demand. The price of salt skyrocketed, and it became a scarce and valuable commodity. Farmers struggled to preserve their meat, and Washington constantly worried about the spoiling of his army's provisions. There are accounts of Continental soldiers being forced to reuse the salty brine from old pork barrels, a desperate measure to preserve a new batch of meat. The struggle for salt was a quiet domestic front in the war, a battle fought not with muskets but with boiling pans and empty barrels. It was a stark reminder that the grand affairs of nations and the destinies of empires can often turn on the control of the most mundane of substances. Salt, the white gold of empires, had also become a silent but powerful weapon in the hands of those who sought to break them. For millennia, salt had occupied a position of immense and undeniable importance in human affairs. Its value was absolute, its necessity unquestioned. It had been the catalyst for technological innovation, the bedrock of global trade networks, and a potent instrument of state power. But the 19th and 20th centuries would witness a profound and irreversible change in humanity's relationship with this ancient mineral. A series of scientific and technological revolutions would quietly conspire to dethrone salt from its lofty position, transforming it from a substance of strategic, almost mystical value into a common, cheap, and ubiquitous industrial commodity. Its story in the modern era is not one of dramatic battles or powerful kings, but one of a quiet and gradual dissolution into the very fabric of our daily lives. The first and most significant blow to salt's exalted status came from the invention of modern food preservation techniques. For thousands of years, salt's primary and most vital role had been to hold back the forces of decay. The development of canning in the early 19th century offered a new way to store food for long periods. By sealing food in airtight containers and then heating it to kill the microorganisms that cause spoilage, foods could be preserved without the heavy, flavor-altering use of salt. This technique was first perfected to feed the armies of Napoleon, but it soon found its way into domestic kitchens. An even more profound change came with the invention of mechanical refrigeration. The ability to create artificial cold, first in industrial ice-making plants and later in home refrigerators and freezers, was a revolution that fundamentally altered the human diet and the global food supply chain. With refrigeration, meat, fish, and dairy could be kept fresh for days or weeks. For the first time in history, humanity was not dependent on salt to preserve its most perishable and valuable foods. The great salt-cured staples of the past, salted cod, barreled beef, and salt pork, slowly transitioned from being dietary necessities to being specialty items, enjoyed for their traditional flavor rather than for their preservative qualities. The immense demand for salt for the purpose of food preservation, which had driven global economies for centuries, began a long and steady decline. At the same time that its primary role was being diminished, the supply of salt was undergoing its own revolution. The industrial age brought new technologies that made the extraction and production of salt easier, cheaper, and more efficient than ever before. The old labor-intensive methods of open-pan boiling and manual mining were replaced by massive industrial-scale operations. Geologists learned how to map the vast subterranean salt domes and beds with greater precision. New mining techniques using powered drills and explosives allowed for the extraction of rock salt on an unprecedented scale. An even more efficient method, known as solution mining, was developed. This technique involved drilling a deep well down into a buried salt deposit. Water would then be pumped down one pipe, where it would dissolve the salt to create a concentrated brine. This brine would then be forced back up to the surface through another pipe and pumped to a processing plant. At the plant, the brine would be evaporated in huge enclosed vessels called vacuum evaporators. These systems were far more fuel efficient than the old open pan methods, allowing for the production of vast quantities of high-purity salt with very little labor. The cost of salt, which had once been so high that it was used as a form of currency, plummeted. It became one of the cheapest and most abundant commodities on the planet. As its value as a food preservative and a currency declined, scientists and industrialists began to discover a vast new world of uses for this cheap and plentiful mineral. Chemists realized that sodium chloride was a fundamental building block for the burgeoning chemical industry. Through the process of electrolysis, salt brine could be separated into its constituent elements, sodium and chlorine, along with sodium hydroxide. These three substances became the cornerstones of the modern chemical industry. Chlorine was essential for sanitation and water purification, and for the production of plastics like PVC, as well as solvents and pesticides. Sodium hydroxide, or caustic soda, was vital for making soap, detergents, paper, and textiles. Soda ash, another derivative of salt, became a crucial ingredient in the manufacturing of glass. Suddenly, the humble salt crystal was a key raw material for an incredible diversity of modern products. Its uses continued to multiply. In the cold climates of the world, it was discovered that spreading rock salt on roads in the winter was a cheap and effective way to melt ice and snow, improving safety and keeping transportation networks open. This single application would come to consume millions of tons of salt every year. It was used in animal nutrition, not just for flavor, but as a vital dietary supplement in livestock feed. It was used in water softening systems, in the dyeing of textiles, in the tanning of leather, and in the manufacturing of rubber. All told, over 14,000 distinct uses for salt have been identified. And so, the story of salt comes full circle, but with a strange and quiet irony. In the ancient world, salt was famous for one thing: its power over life and food. It was visible, tangible, and everyone understood its value. Today, its value is greater and more diverse than ever before, but it has become almost entirely invisible. We are surrounded by products that could not exist without it, yet we are rarely aware of its presence. It is hidden in the plastic of our computers, in the glass of our windows, in the paper of our books, and in the very water we drink. Its most famous role as a seasoning on our food now accounts for only a tiny fraction of its total global consumption. The great salt roads have been paved over by modern highways. The camel caravans have been replaced by cargo ships and freight trains. The oppressive salt taxes have been abolished. The white gold that once funded empires and sparked revolutions has become a quiet, unassuming, and incredibly cheap industrial powder. It has dissolved into the background of our modern world, its dramatic history all but forgotten. But the next time you see a shaker on a table or watch a truck spread salt on a winter road, it is worth remembering the long and silent journey of those simple white crystals. They are the crystallized memory of a primordial sea, the first currency of civilization, and the quiet, unsung mineral foundation upon which much of our modern world is built.